All right, tonight we're going to cover two slide sets, and I assume you got both of them. The first one I've titled Current Issues in Ministerial Taxation, and second set we'll talk Internal Controls. Current Issues, have you ever heard of the group called Freedom from Religion Foundation?
Yes, sir.
I believe it's a group that's based in Wisconsin or Montana or somewhere like that. I forget exactly where it is. They have, over the years, filed a variety of lawsuits. One of the latest ones that they filed, well, they originally filed it, I believe, in 2008, but probably the first one, earliest one they filed, when they started their business as a tax-exempt organization or foundation. The IRS required that they file Form 1023 in order to receive tax-exempt status. After that, every year they have to file a Form 990, which gives the IRS information regarding amount of their contributions they receive, what they do with those contributions, who their major contributors are, etc. So the first thing they did was file a lawsuit against the IRS because churches, as a matter of law, as a matter of rule, are not required to file any paperwork with the IRS in order to receive automatic recognition as a nonprofit entity and a charitable organization. So that was their first lawsuit, and they lost on that particular lawsuit. They also filed a lawsuit about having to file a Form 990 every year because churches are not required to file Form 990 every year. They lost that lawsuit. The next thing they filed a lawsuit on was a minister's housing allowance. And I believe this was back in 2009 when they filed the first lawsuit against, they weren't allowed to claim housing allowance. They lost that lawsuit because the court, not the original court that heard it, but the next court that heard it said they had no standing to file because in their process, they had not tried to pay themselves housing allowance and had not, because of their failure to pay housing allowance, had not been denied any benefit by the IRS. So they threw the lawsuit out. Well, the next thing they do is pay themselves a housing allowance. And then they filed a return, and on that particular return that they filed, they did not claim the housing allowance, but then filed an amended return claiming the housing allowance to make it exempt from income. And the IRS, through bureaucratic error, refunded the amount they asked for on the amended return. Since that time, they've been in and out of court with the IRS over this particular situation. Also, the lady who was one of their directors has since passed away, so it's her estate that's now involved in this lawsuit issue. But they refiled the latest thing in 2015, I believe it was. And since then have, like I said, just been in and out of court with the IRS. The latest judge that heard it, a fairly liberal judge, agreed that that there was discriminatory action there by them not being allowed to claim a housing allowance, and basically yet put his order on hold, awaiting appeal of his order. So this particular organization has been doing a lot of things from a legal standpoint, just challenging tax laws and various other laws that they claim discriminates against them in favor of religion. The local actions note there. I don't know if when you lived up in the Blue Ridge area, you ever ate at Blue Ridge Mountain Barbecue or not. But
yes, sir.
I walked into there one day, and there right by the register was framed a letter from the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And the letter was threatening them with a lawsuit because they had the audacity to, on Sunday afternoon, if you came in after church and brought your church bulletin with you, to give you a 10% discount. So the guy stopped doing his 10% discount if you brought in your church bulletin, and posted the letter there beside the register. So if anybody says why, he'd point at the letter and say, here's why I don't do that anymore. And then the next thing he knew, they sent him another threatening letter, threatening to go to court and sue him if he didn't take the letter down. So he took the letter down, and I talked to him about the situation, and I said, well, was it something you knew, you recognized at the time they came in? And he said, oh, I could tell when this lady walked in the door, she had a burr under her saddle. She had something she was there for a specific purpose to do. So they were targeting basically him because of that situation, and threatening, to carry him to court if he didn't do what they wanted him to do. So they are not just, filing lawsuits in the circuit or the federal courts. They're also walking around trying to do things on a personal level or a local level just to stir up issues for religious organizations. So just to give you some idea of some of the things that are going on in the world out there. There have been recent court cases, and we talked about in the housing allowance lessons about only being allowed to deduct housing allowance for one house. The Religious Liberty Charitable Deductions Protection Act of 1997, the courts basically went in, or the Congress basically went in and said that bankruptcy courts could go in and take back charitable contributions made by people within 1 year of filing bankruptcy if they exceeded 15% of income. Then the bankruptcy courts could go back and reclaim some of those charitable contributions and put them back into the bankruptcy estate and take them away from the charity. Part of that issue was that they were afraid that people were making large donations and then declaring bankruptcy and getting out of paying their bills, and in lieu of that, just making charitable contributions. Part of the 15% limitation is that the Church of Latter-day Saints, for example, the Mormons testified greatly about their belief that their membership have an obligation to tithe. So that was one of their reasons for setting the 15% limitation there. June of 17, and we're still in the June of 17 Congress, the 17-18 Congress is still the current Congress. West Virginia Representative Mooney introduced a resolution, House Resolution number 427, and resolved that the United States government should not infringe upon the ability of American citizens to act in accordance with their sincerely held religious beliefs. And the United States government condemns any behavior by the states that limits the ability of individuals to express their religious beliefs. That was a fairly early version of a religious liberty bill that got introduced. Not much hope for passage of some of those things in a lot of the state legislatures. I know the last couple of years, Georgia has had introduced multiple times by multiple people in their legislature a religious liberty bill, especially since some of the Supreme Court rulings regarding the inability to opt out of giving service to certain groups or people or something. So there is still a fair amount of activity in the state legislatures. And there's still some in the U.S. Congress regarding religious liberty, but I don't know that there's a lot of opportunity that many of those bills will be passed. The next item I want to talk about is a state and local sales tax issue and some property tax issues. Each state is different. So I know, for example, in Georgia, when we go to pay sales tax, or when we go to buy something, we pay sales tax. According to Georgia law, the only thing we are exempt from sales tax on is if we buy a bell to go in a steeple at the church building. That, according to state law, is the only thing that we could be exempt from sales tax. I will have people quite often ask me, they need a, quote, tax exempt number. And I say, for what? Well, I'm going to go buy so-and-so. And I said, we're not tax exempt as far as sales tax is concerned. I know in other states, I believe Tennessee, churches are tax exempt as far as sales tax is concerned. So each state, I just encourage you as you look about the state to figure out what each individual state has as their law regarding whether or not you are exempt from sales tax. When I talk about a 501c3 organization being tax exempt, they're income tax exempt. That does not mean any other state or local laws could not impose sales tax or property tax or something else. As a general rule, most states will recognize that religious buildings, property is exempt from property tax. Give you an example here in Georgia. The church building where we meet, yes, that is exempt from property tax. And yet the copier that we rent, we pay sales tax on, and we pay property tax on that property that we use, that we lease from somebody else. So that just us using it doesn't make us exempt from the property tax that they have to pay. We had a place down outside of Americus, I believe it was, where we had bought a piece of property that was at that point in time being used as a church building. The building on it was used as a church building. After a while, after many years, the congregation died off, and eventually the property the building got raised, so it was just a vacant lot. And the county came in and assessed property tax for it. And that was entirely appropriate because it was no longer being used for that tax exempt purpose. So there's possibilities that if you have property that's not used for the tax exempt purpose, that property tax could be due on it. Another issue that not related to you as the minister so much, but related to the church, and I see more and more discussion about this, is whether the church should be legally organized with a state or just a trusteeship type of situation. I know churches that are on both sides of this question. I know some members of the church who feel very strongly on both sides of this question. But basically it is, should you be a legal entity recognized by the state, and as such have that protection of state law, or should you be just organized as a trusteeship with generally the eldership, if there is an eldership, if not some of the men serving in a trustee capacity to administer the things that go on in the church. The last item on this slide, open carry laws. I would strongly recommend that the church come up with a decision as to whether or not they will allow open carry. You don't necessarily have to publicize that. I wouldn't post it on my website, for example. We do have some members of our congregation who choose to carry. We have not restricted that. We are aware of most of who those people are. We have some who will lock it in their car when they come to services. We have some who will carry it in a holster on their body. We have encouraged that they make it as unobtrusive as possible. Have one gentleman, for example, that when he needs to get up to go do something or something, he's usually sitting there with his jacket off, and he'll put his jacket on so he can cover what's there, and that way he tries to make it less obvious as to what he's doing. But open carry laws is a fairly current issue that I don't think will be resolved anytime soon. As far as I know, in Georgia, they recently expanded the locations where open carry can happen, and churches were included in that expansion. So once again, it may be a function of state law as to whether or not you're included in that. But it is an issue that if you are allowed open carry, I encourage the church to make some decision about whether or not they're going to allow it within the building. The churches as a church are prohibited from engaging in substantial efforts to influence legislation. There is no definition in the Internal Revenue Code of substantial, but we have two court cases, one Seasongood versus Commissioner, the federal second district, where less than 5% was deemed to not be substantial, and in Haswell versus U.S. in the second district, between 16 and 20% was deemed to be substantial. So there's still some gray area there between less than 5 and up to 15%, whether that might be deemed to be substantial or not. But that is a law that churches are prohibited from engaging in substantial efforts to influence legislation. That would be important in some of the current issues that we face in the state legislatures that we talked about earlier, religious freedom bills and some of those sorts of things. So if you are engaging in substantial efforts to influence legislation, you're probably in violation of that law. No 501c3 organization can participate in or intervene in, including the publishing or distribution of statements, any political campaign on behalf of any candidate for public office. However, the IRS acknowledges that this is not intended to restrict free expression on political matters by leaders speaking for themselves as individuals. They are prohibited from making partisan comments in official publications or at official functions. So, for example, you can't stand in the pulpit and endorse a political candidate. You can't print in the bulletin an endorsement of a political candidate. You can't stand in the pulpit and say that as a Christian, we should vote for this particular candidate because of the way this candidate views are, or because of the things this candidate believes, etc. You cannot distribute political information unless it is non-discriminatory. I'll use the word. You know, if you could publish a voter guide, as long as you list everybody in it, and you could, in that voter guide, list all the candidates' positions on various issues. So you could publish a voter guide, for example, that said, you know, ask certain questions or address certain issues and what each candidate's position was on that particular issue, as long as you were comprehensive in that process. But if you do anything that implies that you are favoring one candidate over another, at least as far as your public persona goes, then that would be a violation of this particular rule here. But in a non-public forum, as a minister, speaking only as an individual, you can say whatever you choose to say. The May the 4th, 2017, here it is. May 4th, 2017 executive order issued by Donald Trump directs the IRS not to take adverse action against churches and other tax-exempt religious organizations participating in political activity that stops short of an endorsement of a candidate for office. Really didn't change any of the discussion we had on the previous slide. Since ministers are already free to deliver political speeches and regularly do, churches and other tax-exempt organizations are restricted from endorsing or explicitly opposing political candidates under the 1954 Johnson Amendment. But the executive order Trump signed makes clear that those activities would still not be permitted. Instead, it directs the IRS to provide regulatory relief for organizations that object on religious grounds to a provision in Obamacare, for example, that mandates employers provide certain health services, including coverage for contraception. Big issue when Obamacare came out with the Catholic Church, for example, that they don't want to pay for abortions. They don't want to have their health plans have to pay for abortions. So that's one of the issues that Trump did address, is that they have the IRS provide regulatory relief there. But as far as being able to go and talk publicly and endorse candidates, no, you still can't do that. House Resolution 172, introduced on January the 3rd of 2017 by North Carolina Representative Jones. Section 1, repeal of the 1954 Johnson Amendment banning the free speech and First Amendment rights of churches and exempt organizations. And he is, in effect, asking that we repeal, or that Congress repeal, that particular amendment. And by the way, Johnson is Lyndon Johnson, who later became president. In 1954, he introduced, and it was passed, an amendment to the Internal Revenue Code restricting ministers and religious organizations from participating in public political campaigns. So that's what Representative Jones from North Carolina was introducing, a resolution to repeal. That has not happened. The likelihood is it will not happen. go back up here. So just current issues that are going on. The final issue that I have on this slide is a Form 8822B requirement. If you have employees and file payroll tax returns with the IRS, the IRS introduced in 2010 a requirement that if you change addresses or change responsible parties, that you notify them on Form 8822B. The church is not exempt from that. If you have a change in treasurer, for example, you would need to inform the IRS on this Form 8822B of who that change in the responsible party was. If the church moved to a different location, you need to update the IRS on this form of the new address, those sorts of things. So churches from that standpoint are not exempt from a lot of those laws. So let's see if there's anything else here I missed that I wanted to talk about. Nope, I think that covers all of that. Any questions on any of the things we've covered so far?
No, sir.
All right, well, I'm going to stop share there and share screen now with the, I don't know if the new slide deck popped up or not, but well, something's happened to it. Let me reopen it. Okay. The last issue we're going to talk about, or the last deck we're going to talk about, is financial controls. There are three what I call cornerstones of financial controls. One is segregation of duties, one is transparency, and the other one is oversight. We'll talk in some detail about each of those. And the reason I think you need to hear about this, or ministers need to hear about this, is because a lot of times you're in a situation where nobody else is involved, nobody else has knowledge or understanding of what's going on, and you need to have an understanding of some of the better ways in which to handle financial matters. So these three cornerstones: segregation of duties, transparency, and oversight. Segregation of duties simply means that more than one individual will be involved in documenting, recording, reconciling, and reporting on financial information. This is an easy thing to violate because a lot of times you have limited numbers of members and only one person serves as treasurer, and that person takes the contribution, counts the contribution, makes the deposit of the contribution, writes all the checks, reconciles the bank statement, prepares the financial statement, and reports it back to the church. And there's a lot of problems and potential problems in that. Anybody that is that involved and has that much control can basically do anything they want with the church's money, and nobody would know anything about it unless all of a sudden there's just no money there, and it comes to life that way. You know, if they gave you your paycheck and it bounced, you'd start asking questions. But yeah, that segregation of duties is a very important thing. Where I'm treasurer, we have a group of men, about 5 men that count the contribution every Sunday. They then give it to someone else other than me who actually makes the bank deposit. We make that bank deposit as a remote deposit type situation. So we have a machine at the church building where we just run checks through, and it scans them electronically and transmits that file to the bank. So that's how we do the deposit. Cash deposits are taken to the bank by that individual. So as they count the contribution, they have a sheet, what they call a count sheet, and the cash is counted and tallied up that way. And then it is given in a bank bag to the individual who will deposit it. He compares what's in the bank bag to what's on their count sheet and fills out the deposit slip, carries it to the bank, and gives me our copy of the deposit slip. So I record it in the financial statements. I write all the checks, but, and I reconcile the bank statements. But I produce also a financial report every month where I give everybody that wants, any member that wants to see it, a copy of our financial report, where we reconciled everything, where we've reported all the expenses, et cetera, et cetera. There's still improvements we could make as far as having other people involved. The beginning of this year, late last year, beginning of this year, we started taking contributions through PayPal. One of our deacons actually set that up. He and I have the right or the ability to log into the PayPal account and record what was contributed that way. So I go out there and pick that up and report on it in our financial statements, just like I do any other contribution. I also take all the records, the checks that were deposited, and I create a spreadsheet. Every year we go through and we produce a report for every one of our members as far as what they contributed for the year. Not trying to totally replace what the IRS requirement is, that if you contribute over 250, that you have to have that record from the church before you can file your tax return. We just feel like it's important for every one of our members to have that annual accounting of here's what your contribution was. So every week I key into a spreadsheet and then summarize it at the end of the year, sort it by individual, produce a cover letter for it, and give it out to them every January. So segregation of duties, the simplistic idea is more than one person is involved. So one person, for example, is counting the money, somebody else is depositing the money, and somebody else is recording that deposit. So that helps us control that somebody's not sticking money in their pocket, cash money that comes in. Cash money for us is not a major concern. We have less than 2% of our total annual budget comes in cash. So the vast majority of what we get, probably close to 10% will come in through PayPal this year, and the other 88% plus will come in as checks. So we are trying to do better at the segregation of duties function. Transparency. The dissemination of financial information such that any interested party can, with minimal effort, confirm the accuracy and completeness of the information. So I said earlier that I produce every month a financial statement. Now, my my disappointment is that I'd give it to the secretary every month. She would run off 30 copies of it, put it on our welcome center in our foyer, and anybody that wanted to could pick it up. And next month I'd give her the new financial statement, and she'd run off 30 copies and throw away the 30 copies she printed last month. Nobody picked them up. Nobody looked. Nobody cared. So we started just posting them in a binder that sit outside her office door, and anybody that wants to can pull that binder off and look. And it's got a whole year's worth in there. So anybody that wants to, and we've told in our congregational meetings, I've made the statement that if you have any question about what we spent money on or who we spent money with or whatever, as long as it's not talking about employee compensation, I'll tell you about it. We'll discuss it. I'll let you know what's going on. So that's part of this transparency issue. They can, with minimal effort, figure out who we're spending money with and confirm the accuracy and completeness of the information. The oversight, the ability of independent parties to review and confirm accuracy and completeness of financial information. So, if you have an eldership, I believe that the eldership should, with regularity, take the financial statements and take the bank statements and compare the two and confirm that the balance that's being shown is the same balance. I've heard stories, I know they exist, where the treasurer does everything. There is no transparency. There is no segregation of duties. There is no oversight until one day the treasurer's gone on vacation and something comes up of an quote emergency type situation, and somebody writes a check and it bounces. And they don't know why it bounced, and they go talking and they figure out that, oh, the treasurer has stolen all the money. 6 figures and above. So it's not unusual that something like this occur. You hear it regularly. If you follow any of the financial press in nonprofit organizations and government entities, and you see it all the time. I have offered as a CPA a situation where an owner that runs a business, that we will come in as that independent party and we will get the bank to do a special run of a bank statement for us. We will come in and reconcile that bank statement to your financial records, and we will figure out if there's an issue there. We will look at the endorsement on those checks and see if there's a lot of handwritten endorsements. We will look at the addresses that checks are sent to for the vendors and compare those to the employees and see if there are employees setting up bogus vendors out there and sending themselves checks to steal money from the company. So there are issues out there financially where people figure out how to steal money from various and sundry parties. And this is just a way that you as a minister might want to keep an eye on the finances of the congregation, because if the money's gone, it's hard for the church. It causes all sorts of problems for the church if somebody steals from the church. Areas benefiting from the segregation of duties, the counting, depositing of contributions we talked about, the dispersing funds and the reconciling bank statements that we talked about. Separate people do that so that one person that's dispersing the funds can't hide something or conceal something in the bank reconciliation process. Recording transactions, preparing financial reports. Those should be separated so that the person that's doing the recording of the transactions, once again, can't hide something in the financials so that people don't ask about it. Running the payroll, filing the payroll reports. Once again, a separate entity, separate party doing those things gives you better ability for transparency and lack of theft going on. Areas benefiting from transparency, budgeting. I don't know if y'all do a budget, but I encourage every person, every congregation to have some sort of budget. The reason I encourage that is that a budget is simply just a plan for what we're going to do. We try to use our budget as a process to monitor and ensure that the works we want to accomplish are what we focus on. I've had the minister, for example, say before that, the budget process we go through and the tying of the budgeting to the works that we're involved in is some of the best he's done as far as dealing with the financial side of the house. We normally talk about budgeting and people don't want to do it. They don't want to spend the time on it. They don't want to spend the effort to do one. But for us, it's simply that gauge of here's where we're going to focus. Here's what the things are that are important to us, and we're going to show that by our budgeting. So every year we have a congregational meeting and we talk about our budget. We talk about the things that have increased or decreased and why we made that decision to do that. The areas where we want to spend more time and effort and money involved in certain works. We talked briefly about the financial reporting. That needs to be there so that any member can look at it, can ask questions about it, can get an understanding of what's going on. Member letters for contributions. I like the idea of giving members these letters because it is another check and balance against what's going on in the financial records. Before I produce these letters, I reconcile them to the financial statements so that what we show for total contributions for the year is the same dollar amount as what shows up on the member letters. So that if anybody wants to come back and say, prove it to me, we got the proof right there. So member letters is another way for transparency to occur so that members can feel comfortable that the monies they're contributing are actually going to the benefit of the church, not being stolen by the treasurer. Excess compensation issues we've talked about a couple of times over the course of the quarter. If, like I said, we as an eldership have chosen not to reveal compensation to general membership, but if somebody had an issue with excess compensation, it's a discussion we would be willing to have with somebody. Areas benefiting from oversight, potential fraud or theft. As I was billing my clients today, I was sending out a little article that I had run across over the last month where a CPA, who's also a financial planner, who's spent many years talking to clients about this, got a letter from the Social Security Administration congratulating him on starting to draw his Social Security benefits. Well, the problem was he had not made that decision. In fact, he had made the decision to wait until age 70, and yet at his 67th birthday, somebody else created a bogus account for him, got the Social Security Administration to do direct deposit into that bogus bank account, which they then turned into gift card type, payment card type things on that bank account, and stole over $19,000 out of his Social Security account. Social Security Administration let some fraudulent person start his benefits for him. So he's facing all sorts of issues because Social Security sent him a 1099 reporting that as income to him for the year. So now he's got other issues he's got to deal with. I could tell you story after story after story where, a person hires this particular employee they think is just wonderful, and what winds up is they're stealing the company blind. I've seen multiple examples of that. So there needs to be oversight, and sometimes you as the minister are the only person qualified to do some of that oversight, just to prevent potential fraud or theft. And people, if they know somebody's going to look and understand and examine what's going on, are a lot less likely to engage in some of these activities. And then financial reporting would be a good thing that would benefit from financial controls. Other financial control concern areas. We talked briefly about the proper budgeting or planning for the work. I firmly believe that, as I said, every church should have a budget, and every church should use that budget as a planning tool for the work they want to accomplish. I'm not saying that a budget automatically says we can't pay that, or we can't afford that, or we can't do that. A budget is simply a plan. When you took your trip to Pigeon Forge, you had a plan on how you were going to get there. But if something came up and you needed to deviate from that plan, you're going to deviate from it. You're going to change that plan. And that's, to me, is what a budget is. A budget is a plan. We're going to do this in our work this year, and here's how we choose to accomplish that. But if something comes up, we're in the middle of trying to replace 3 different high-capacity HVAC units, because for the last 5 years, we've been saying, okay, we know one's going to quit, so we're going to budget for it. Well, we've budgeted out of reserves, or chosen to cover that out of reserves. It's just a planning tool. You don't know when that thing's going to quit, but you want to be prepared if it does, so you budget for it. The second item there, contribution letters, the IRS requirements. We talked about some of those in some of the earlier classes. There are specific requirements that the IRS puts out about contributions in excess of $250. You have to have the letter in hand before you file the tax return. The letter has to state in the letter that whether or not any goods or services were received in exchange for that contribution. If goods or services were received, then you don't get to deduct that value. So I'm starting to see a lot more, for example, in public broadcasting things where they give you call now and for $65 you'll get this free CD. Well, you don't get the deduction for the value of the CD. So, I'm seeing more and more in the letters where they're tightening up what they put in the letters based on the IRS requirements. Told you some examples of court cases where somebody lost a $30,000 charitable contribution because they didn't have the letter in hand. And by the time it worked out, the court finally said, look, you didn't follow the rule of the law, so you don't get to take the deduction. Or the charity didn't follow the rule of the law, so you don't get to take the deduction. We talked about the excess compensation issues, state unemployment issues. As a minister and as a church employing you as a minister, you are exempt from federal unemployment. State unemployment is a state-only issue. And I'll illustrate it this way. 15 years ago, the state of Georgia had on their Department of Labor website a document that said ministers as employees of churches are exempt from state unemployment. They no longer have that document on their website. And their answer when I call them and ask is, send us the specific information and we'll give you a ruling. So Georgia has changed their stance on whether or not ministers are exempt from state unemployment. Apparently has changed, because I haven't sent them anything and I haven't tried to get a ruling on it. But I have not filed state unemployment forms because I'm relying on that earlier documentation that I have a copy of that says you're exempt. And we've been in the same location hiring or employing some of the same people all that whole time. Reporting on Form 1099 MISC. Now, this is a little different than paying you and reporting it on a Form 1099. This is anything else that you might do where you hire somebody to come in and do a gospel meeting, or you hire people for a summer series, or you have a lectureship and hire speakers for the lectureship, or have a seminar on something else, or a ladies' day or something like that, and you pay that individual more than $600, you're supposed to report that on a 1099. We hire policemen to do traffic control at the building on Sunday morning. That we give them a 1099 every year for that. Minister withholding, as we said earlier, a church is exempt from withholding for the minister. However, if the minister chooses to request, and if the church agrees to do so, they can do withholding on the minister, and they can submit that to the IRS on the minister's behalf. We talked early on in the payroll type issues about exempt from Social Security, where we have a minister who is not exempt from Social Security. We have chosen to pay him his salary plus our share of what Social Security would be. That's that Social Security gross up piece that we talked about there. So that's another financial concern issue. Properly documented plans. We talked about retirement plans. We've talked about reimbursement plans. We've talked about a variety of things that if you don't have a properly documented plan, you can run afoul of the IRS or some other situation that you run into. And then certain annual amounts that you should not exceed. So, for example, if you're going to pay a minister and contribute something toward an ERISA plan of a retirement, there are certain limitations on how much you can put into that retirement account as being an ERISA qualified retirement account. So there are certain annual amounts that you have to adhere to there. All right. That's all I have to say for those two slide decks. So if you've got questions, we'll entertain them now. Otherwise, I'll save the save the video and post it out.
I don't have any questions, brother. I thank you.
All right. Now, I will remind you, next week is final exam.
Yes, sir.
We'll do similar to we did for the midterm. We'll review the last, since the January 20 or January 25th and forward slide decks, and then we'll do the final exam. And you are due to send me a paper on whether you would or would not opt out of Social Security and reasons for or against. And like I said, I don't care which side you take, just a paper that is due that week. Okay? All right.
Thanks,
We'll see you, Justin. Bye.